my commitment is not to objectivity, but to fairness. And so I think what I'd like to see a lot more of is people who say, I have a slant, but I'm also fair, and I'm not going to misrepresent people's views. And if I disagree with them, I'll try to disagree. I'm committed to honesty.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Greater Texas Podcast. I have a fantastic guest this time with Jack Craver, the founder, writer, manager of the Austin Politics newsletter. Jack, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Yeah, it's great. So we're going to start with a little background. So Jack, tell me, where are you from originally?
That's a tough question to answer. I moved around a few times. My dad was a journalist, so it was 0 to 4 was in Cuernavaca, Mexico. My dad was writing in Mexico City. And then Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania from 4 to 10, Paris, France from 10 to 14, and then high school was in New Jersey in the New York area.
So Paris to New Jersey? Is that
Oh, and great. It is funny because my dad wrote for Business Week magazine, a legacy magazine, and his career is very much it's such a contrast with my own. It's really this old model of journalism where you get paid a really good salary to, cover the steel industry in Pittsburgh, because you got to have someone on the ground covering the steel industry, write a couple articles a month. And
well, that's great. Well, we'll get into how things have changed and what you're doing now. But then you went to Wisconsin, is that right?
Yeah, University of Wisconsin, and
I guess journalism because of your dad, right? Was that a big influence?
Well, originally I wanted to be a politician. I wanted to run the show, but I eventually got disillusioned with that and gravitated towards journalism. I started a blog in college that focused on local politics in Madison, Wisconsin, and then through that, ended up getting a job at a newspaper after college, the Capital Times, and
in Madison,
and had a conventional or semi-conventional journalism job for 2.5 years, and then went and spent a year in France to teach English, and then my wife got a job in Austin, so I came here, and I've been freelancing ever since.
Gotcha. And when you first started freelancing, I think maybe you mentioned before, was that for the Monitor or what was that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, freelancing, the Austin Monitor was a godsend, because the Austin Monitor, if you're not familiar with it, covers City Hall, and it's entirely based on freelance labor, and so they pay you per article. And so I was able to derive a decent income from doing a few articles a week for the Monitor, and then also just doing sort of commercial copywriting.
Gotcha.
And then I would do some feature writing for the Austin Chronicle or Texas Observer. So it was cool. I immediately was able to put together a decent living and not have a boss or a 9-to-5. And so as soon as I was able to do that, I decided I never wanted to have like a real job again.
Is this sort of like, if I'm a journalism student, I'm coming out of school, is this kind of a common track now? Or can you still get the jobs at the newspapers where you're working directly for the newspaper? Or
Sure. I mean, there are those jobs. It's just tough. I mean, there's just a pretty low ceiling on pay, I think, and there's not much job security. And so you got to get really lucky to make it to a place where you have good job security and you're making good money. I'm very supportive of my brothers and sisters at the Austin American-Statesman, recently unionized, very supportive of that. But it's a scary place to be because you're working for, these newspapers have been gobbled up by large corporations, and in many cases that lack the dedication to that sort of community mission that some of the legacy companies had. And many of them are really trying to just absolutely squeeze the last bit of life out of these newspapers that's possible. And they're, cutting to the bone.
One thing I notice is there's just a lot less reporting done on local issues, right?
Absolutely. If you talk to someone at the Statesman, their newsroom is a shadow of what it was 10 or 15 years ago. I don't want to mess up the numbers, but I remember hearing something like they used to have 8 reporters covering, was it, Williamson County or something like that. And now they have somebody who covers Williamson and Hayes.
Right.
They have one person who assigned to City Hall, and they'll send him to do other stuff too. I mean, it's just, they just don't have the manpower to really give local politics and other things, but in my local politics, the coverage it deserves.
Right. Makes sense. All right. Well, let's talk about the Austin Politics newsletter, which is as I mentioned, the email newsletter that you started and produce and everything. And by the way, folks who are listening, if you're in the Central Texas area and you don't get Jack's with a daily email newsletter, I don't know what you're waiting for, because it's fantastic. It's one of the best ways to keep in tune with local political scenes. So tell me how you got sort of started with that and how that started.
Yeah, so I'd been doing my freelance thing for a few years, and through my coverage for the Austin Monitor, where I was often assigned to cover City Hall or the Planning Commission, I'd just gotten really interested in those issues. And so And the Monitor was cool about letting me, I was allowed to just sort of blog on my own. And so I started a blog and just started writing a lot about the politics of growth, right? And which is really the most important thing happening in a growing city is how are we going to grow?
Right.
And so I started writing about that on my own. Just for fun, I guess, kind of. I sort of thought it might lead to some like copywriting clients if people, but one thing led to another, and someone said, you could do this professionally, you could make money off of it. And so I launched the newsletter 3.5 years ago. And at first the email newsletter, I just thought, okay, I'll have my blog, and then for people who are really, really dedicated and want to get really in the weeds and want to help me out, they'll get this additional newsletter. But quickly I learned that the newsletter itself was the product.
Right.
And so I just abandoned the blog and just focused on the email newsletter. And so now it comes out 4 times a week, and it focuses almost exclusively on City Hall.
Yeah. So tell me, what's a sort of regular day like then doing that?
I mean, I'm terribly disorganized. I don't do nearly as much planning as I should, and so I'm often, start a morning not knowing what I'm going to write about that day, and just sort of wing it. But ideally, I spend a lot of time watching city council meetings, city commissions, calling people up, interviewing people, looking through city documents, and then trying to come up with an interesting angle on what I find. My mission is to really get in the weeds of public policy, but to make it accessible to normies, if you will.
Right. Yeah, well, I think you've certainly done that. Are the people at City Hall generally receptive to you when you call or show up and ask them for questions?
It's a mixed bag. It really is. I don't know. I mean, in journalism in general, it's funny how sometimes you just call up some city official and they're absolutely delighted to talk to you and to be very frank with you and give you everything you want. And then other people are instinctively paranoid about journalists and don't want to talk at all and only deal with you through very formal channels where they'll, give you a short statement or pass you on to somebody else. It's a huge mixed bag.
And one of the things I find interesting about your email newsletter is it's not just news. You editorialize, basically. What was the thought process to going into that? Like, you decided to do that?
True objectivity is impossible. We all have biases.
Sure.
That's not to say that I don't respect the traditional, the commitment from a traditional outlet like the Statesman to a certain objectivity. Even if it's impossible to attain, I think that there is value in striving for it.
Right.
But I don't think that, I think that opinion journalism, which is what I do, can still be very valuable. And I think that it doesn't have to just be straight reporting on one hand and then, talk radio on the other hand. My commitment is not to objectivity, but to fairness. And so I think what I'd like to see a lot more of is people who say, I have a slant, but I'm also fair and I'm not going to misrepresent people's views. And if I disagree with them, I'll try to disagree. I'm committed to honesty, honest disagreement. And, I try as much as possible to, accurately represent the views of those I disagree with. I understand, for instance, on land use, like I don't just assume that people are against, zoning reform because they don't want poor people living next to them. Like I understand they have views. They think that what they're doing is best maybe for the environment or for affordability, even if I disagree with that. And so I try not to misrepresent their views.
I think you do a good job. And I think that in addition, obviously we talked about it as opinion, but you also get the facts out there too. And the facts are, it's not like you slant the facts. I mean, like some unfortunate news organizations. I mean, there is good fact in there and then you give your opinion on it. So I think you do a pretty good mix of it.
Thank you. And I also I make mistakes all the time and I try to be open about that and issue corrections, as painful as it can be sometimes.
How do you decide what the picture is going to be every day?
There's not much of I try to take pictures around town, good, bad, and ugly of anything going on in Austin. And so, I just put up whatever I've taken the last couple of days.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Okay. Let's pivot a little bit and let's talk about, like Texas is this is called the, Build Better Texas. Texas is as you mentioned, a fast growing state. Central Texas, Austin's an incredibly fast growing city. It's the number one issue that we face here. And so, I think when we talk about it, there's a number of issues, but certainly housing is probably at the top of that list. And I just want to, what do you think going forward are some of the biggest issues for facing Austin in the housing area?
Yeah, we don't have enough of it. We don't have enough of it, and we don't have enough diversity of housing. We have sort of a polarized housing options where, we've got large apartment complexes that are on certain types of roads, and then we have single family homes. That's sort of the polarized,
Right.
And so we need a lot more supply. We need a lot more options. And then we also need to just make it cheaper to build whatever kind of housing is legal. Most recent example that's coming up is, parkland fees. Every residential developer has to pay fees to the parks department that's supposed to fund the development of new parks. And, the fees have increased, are set to double again just in 1 year. It's going to be about $7,000 per new apartment unit, to pay for park. And that we all want parks, but that obviously those are costs passed on to renters. And there's a million other fees like that too.
All right. Well, let's take it piece by piece.
Yes.
So let's start with the November bond election.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that? What's the story background of that?
That's good. We passed a $250 million bond in 2018 overwhelmingly, and that was record smashing, and that's good. It'll create, I don't know how many units, a few thousand.
So I actually read this. So the last three bonds, it was an article I read today, have produced 6,700 housing units.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's good. It's still just, that's a pretty small slice of the housing
and my
market.
question is what type of housing those are? Like you talked about before, are those single family? Are those multifamily? What are they? So I don't know the answer to that. So I'm not.
A few of them are actually single family, and I think that's pretty dumb. Like there's, but no, most of it's going to be large multifamily, and it's going to be, apartment developments with affordable housing developers who are using a combination of sort of federal tax credits and, getting some help from the city bonds and building affordable housing units. But then the city also does the bond also helps funds home repair for
Right.
low income homeowners, and that's good. But then they're like, when I mentioned single family, there's this sort of what I consider kind of a symbolic program called the, where the city's bought like 36 single family homes and is, hooking up some very, very lucky low income or, people at 80% MFI,
Right.
and giving them a single family home to own. And that's great. It's just a very inefficient way of spending public money.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
It's just kind of a distraction, I think.
I'm sure most people listeners know, but MFI, median
Yeah.
family income.
Yes,
in the area.
yeah.
So, I mean, that's, like you said, that's a very inefficient way to spend to save 36, which I mean, like, great for those 36 families. It's great, but okay. So do you think that'll? I don't know if you have a. Do you think that'll pass, or you have an?
I would guess it will. The 2018 election cycle there was no organized opposition to the housing bond, and I think
there is now. Save Austin Now has said at least that they're going to oppose it, right?
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I'm skeptical that they'll mount like a really formidable opposition campaign, but we'll see. But I think so. 2018 was generally just a very liberal electorate. I mean, it was a big Democratic wave election, so that was a good year to put any kind of liberal initiative on the ballot.
Right.
Obviously, the assumption is 2022 will not be like that. But if I had to bet, I still think it'll pass. Yeah.
Okay. I want to get into one of the things. Like the housing bonds, as I live right now, until we get more details, at least I think that I agree with you. It seems like a good idea. We certainly also need reform in everything we're doing, and obviously we know it's been tried with Code Next, and that failed in an interesting way. And so I want to get your thoughts on what happened with Code Next and what the future is, and sort of revising the land development code.
Right. So in 2019. There were 7 votes on city council for overhauling the land development code. And that proved to not be enough because a group of activists sued. And without going into all the details, basically the courts have decided that you need 9 out of 11 votes to pass an overhaul of the land development code if property owners are protesting to their rezoning.
Right. Which means you can't do an overhaul of the land development code because there's going to be some properties protesting. So you're effectively going to have hearings for each individual zoning change.
Well,
right?
That's really, there's still a lot of ambiguity and a lot of unanswered questions about how the law would be interpreted. But the court rulings have really only applied to zoning. So doing a massive rezoning of the city can't be done without 9 votes, probably. But so anyway, it's just important to keep that in perspective. Like there was a big majority in favor of reform, but they were blocked by a minority. It was essentially a filibuster that has held up the land development code. And it's a filibuster that is far more formidable than the filibuster people are always complaining about in the U.S. Senate, because you need 9 out of 11 votes. But I think that the narrative politically has changed in Austin, especially in the last 2 years when the prices have just really gotten to obscene levels. We've been talking about affordability the entire time I've been in Austin, but the last couple of years is just, it's a whole new level. And you're seeing so many middle class people who make good money, maybe even in tech or whatever, who say I can't buy here.
Right.
And, or people who can't rent here. And so I really do think the narrative has shifted. And I think that we see both mayoral candidates, Celia Israel, Kirk Watson, talking a lot about doing something about housing. And my focus, my big priority would be on compatibility.
Right.
That's, and council passed a couple of sort of tepid reforms to compatibility.
So let's talk before we get into that.
Yes.
So we're going to talk now about some of the things that can be done that would help housing and compatibility. What is compatibility?
Okay.
Tell us what.
Yes, compatibility regulations dictate the height. They restrict the height of a building based on its proximity to a single family house. So if you're within a certain distance of a single family house, you can't go over a certain height.
Right.
And Austin's compatibility regulations are far stricter than that of any other major city that I've seen.
Even along these
major corridors.
Major corridors, right?
Yes.
Exactly.
So that's why you'll see a major corridor like
South Lamar.
South Lamar, but or South First is even worse in that you don't see tall buildings. They have the zoning for tall buildings, but no, they're 50 feet away from a single family property, so you can't build any. You can't build you certainly can't build 6 stories, which is what we should see on streets like that.
Right.
And so if you can't build, if you can't build to a certain height for a multifamily, for an apartment complex, it's just not worth it economically. You're not going to build a 2-story,
Right.
And so that's why along some of our major corridors, which are supposed to be sort of the most active commercial and residential hubs in our city, you see car washes, you see auto body shops, payday loan stores, all these things that nobody really wants on our main corridors.
Right. Now, you said that there was a small change to that recently. I remember writing about that, but it was like a relatively small change. Do you think there is appetite for a bigger change?
I sure hope so. I think that, the message coming from the mayor and some other people on council was sort of, I think what they basically said is, look, we're going to do a small change, and hopefully after these elections, we'll have a more ambitious city council that's willing to go further. And I hope that's the case. I know that, broadly speaking, there's 4 people on city council who I've termed preservationists, people who are hostile to density generally.
Right.
2 of them are leaving. Whether whether their successors will be friendlier to housing or not is yet we'll see.
We don't know. Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, my frustration with like the compatibility to, my frustration with housing policy in general is it's not just about political will. It's also about knowledge and sophistication. And so with this compatibility debate that I saw last time, I just saw like there are council members who want to do the right thing, but sometimes they don't know how to, and they don't have the staff support to do it. And they're up on the dais there, and they don't know much about this issue. And so if you tell them, okay, we're reducing the maximum compatibility setback from 500 feet to 300 feet, they say, oh, well, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, actually, it's probably not going to do that much.
Right.
And it's tough, to get some of these changes through.
Yeah.
And I think that's a failure on the part of the real estate community to a certain extent. I think the real estate community has not done a good job.
I want to talk about that because I think that's a really good point. It hasn't been, at least to my knowledge. I mean, actually, we tried to get one a while ago with Ward's group, and there was so little activity from the real estate group that basically that pack kind of went away. And I think it's kind of a failure of the real estate community here in Austin to really have developed a pack to get out there and argue on their behalf. And I look, I'm a lawyer who represents these guys.
Yeah.
And so it's not comfortable for me to say that, but it's the reality.
Yeah. And you have much more insight into their politics and their culture than I do. From the outside, my sense is that there's not much of, there's this burgeoning activist, sort of urbanist YIMBY movement that is very ideologically supportive of density for a number of environmental and economic reasons. And then you have the real estate folks who, they support that stuff too, but I for some reason there's not much cohesion between those two groups. The real estate folks, a lot of them are, I don't know, just kind of buttoned up Republican types who I don't know if they seem
But is housing even a blue-red issue?
No, it's not, but the way people talk about it differs based on their politics and their culture, and a lot of these urbanists and YIMBYs, obviously they're very in favor of transit, public transit
right.
and walkability, and I don't know, there's just a different, and Rika is very much in support of, expanding I-35 and doing all kinds of stuff that urbanists hate.
Right. I see. I gotcha. That makes
sense. That's not to say they can't be allies on housing. They should be,
Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that could change that could really help, which I think are parking limitations, reduce the parking requirements, I should say.
We should eliminate parking requirements. I don't want, I am so, there's no justification for parking requirements ever. They never make sense. And it's frustrating explaining this to people. They say, well, no, I still want parking. I drive. Parking's not going away. I'm just saying there's no reason the government should ever mandate parking, ever.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
And I don't see why this issue has to be compromised on. And this is not we could eliminate parking requirements today and it will be years and years before people start to tell the difference. I mean, because people are going to provide parking. I mean,
right.
It's just an economic, imperative.
Makes sense. And I agree. Minimum lot sizes. I think that's, we have these, 5,000 plus minimum
5,750 square feet. Yeah, no, that's ridiculous too. I mean, and that could be my focus, my priority right now is sort of big multifamily and mixed use on the corridors, because that's the best way to quickly boost housing production, but also it aligns with public transit. But obviously, missing middle housing is really important in the long term too, and that can be a really important way to just allow people to get housing that's just a little bit cheaper than a single family home, right?
Right.
So townhouses, quadplexes, sixplexes like that. It's not going to be cheap. And this is the challenge, to tell people, no, anything you build new is not going to be cheap, but it is cheaper than the alternative, which is a 3,000 square foot house.
There in other cities you see, I know, like out Northwest Seattle, things like that, you'll see people who have ADUs and are now able to subdivide those lots and sell off the ADUs as the separate housing. And obviously, heck, a lot of people can't even have ADUs here, right?
Yeah, that's another really ridiculous thing. I mean, most single family lots in the city now can have an ADU, but then there's arbitrarily a big chunk of them that can't, It's just and then there are other weird rules that kind of just disincentivize like duplexes and ADUs, and for what?
Right. Exactly. For what? That's a good way to put it. And then I think one of the things that happen where groups oppose something, and I don't doubt why they're doing it. I just think that it's the wrong decision. And I look at something like you wrote yesterday about the Zap townhomes and how that didn't go through. And can you tell us how does that happen, or what?
It's just this weird. Well, there's just an impulse that I think it is eroding, but there is just a certain type of person on these planning commissions that just believes that if the people who live in the neighborhood currently show up to a meeting and say they don't want something, then that's it. That's the most important thing. And they just believe in the right of sort of incumbent homeowners to dictate what comes into their neighborhood.
Now, is that So the people, in your opinion, the people on city council, they understand this issue for the most part, affordable housing, and it's a real issue?
I hope so. I think so. I don't know, man.
But is it just political pressure, you think that's?
Well, so we have to distinguish between city council and some of these volunteer commissions, like the zoning and plating commission. So city council, everybody is now at least saying we're in a housing crisis, which I actually don't think was the case a few years ago. They're at least saying, they at least have conceded some of these points. We need more housing supply, but not too much.
Right.
Whereas like you see at the lower level, like the sort of at the neighborhood associations and some of the people, the volunteer commissioners who are appointed by city council members to be on zoning and plating commission or the planning commission. Some of those people are still stuck in the, no, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. I don't want to hear it. Like affordability really just isn't sort of entering into their calculation.
Gotcha.
And, and I don't think they even care.
So what do you think? I mean, maybe this is a question for after the election, but what do you think is the most like what's facing Austin in affordability? How are we going to grow with affordability in the next year or two? Are we going to relax some of these things we talked about, or is this completely dependent on the election, you think?
The election matters a lot. I mean, it's hard for me to predict what a Kirk Watson or Celia Israel would do. And important for people to understand, the mayor, we don't have a strong mayor system here. The mayor's vote counts as much as every other council member.
Still the mayor, though.
It's the mayor. You got some bully pulpit, depending on how you use it, if you're a skilled politician or not. District 9 is going to be an important race. So Kathy Tovo, who's definitely been,
what did you call that group earlier?
The preservationists.
Yeah.
I mean, she's been a pretty formidable obstacle.
Very skilled politician.
Yes, and so in that race, you have like at least 4 candidates who are basically YIMBY urbanist types. Talk a lot about increasing housing.
Is there any front runner in that race right now?
It's really hard to say, but you got to imagine that Linda Guerrero, who is endorsed by Kathy Tovo and the neighborhood folks, you'd have to bet on her probably making it into a runoff. So there is a chance that somebody similar to Kathy Tovo will continue in that seat.
Right.
And the thing is, District 9 is just so important in terms of, because it's this, I mean, it is central city, and that's where we actually need the density the most, is like, right on Guadalupe, for instance. I mean, that's the most depressing thing, is that's right where our light rail is going to go, right along Guadalupe and Hyde Park. And yet you have, again, just auto body shops, car washes, all these single story uses that really should be demoed and replaced with big mixed use developments.
Yeah.
But in that case, there's not only compatibility regulations, but there's the Hyde Park Conservation District, which is a whole other.
Hyde Park residents are fierce about protecting.
Yes, which is funny because Hyde Park is actually, if the rest of the city were more like Hyde Park, that would be great. Because they have there's all kinds of housing in Hyde Park, and some of the older neighborhoods too, like Clarksville. You'll see this mix of multifamily and single family and duplexes and stuff. A lot of that stuff would not be legal if built today.
Right.
Interesting. It was really the 1984, we just screwed everything up in the 80s.
Except for the music. It was
Yeah.
Since we brought up the elections, I want real quick on that. I think at least the sort of general consensus is Kirk Watson's the front runner, but I've read in your things that Celia's closing in, right?
Well, we'll see. He's the front runner. I mean, he's raised $1 million, which is absolutely record.
Considering there's a
busting
$350 or $700,
$400 limit now, per individual. So that's really impressive. But there was a poll that came out the other day, and Celia Israel's campaign paid for it, but it was from a respected firm that showed, when first asked about the candidates, it was 30% said Watson, 13% said Celia, 10% said Jennifer Verdon, who's a conservative candidate. So to me, if Celia can get enough money, either raising from her own campaign or having some outside group that supports her and isn't subject to the typical fundraising limits.
Yeah,
you could have a race. I mean, because 30%, that's not that it's not wrapped up. And I do think in November, especially with with Roe v. Wade getting overturned and abortion really activating a lot of voters, particularly women voters.
And Beto will probably drive people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I just think a lot of people, the average Austin voter is going to spend 43 seconds thinking about the mayor's race, right? And a lot of, there is a well-established advantage for female candidates in Travis County. It exists. I mean, there are a lot of people who will vote for a woman candidate, if they don't have other information about. And again, I think this year there's a chance that dynamic will be even more pronounced because of the reproductive rights being so big.
Yeah. Real quick, so I know there's 2 other districts that I think are kind of in flux. 3 POs done. Do we have a thought on that?
So I think the front runner in that race is Jose Velasquez, and I don't know much about his views on development. My sense is that he's not firmly in either camp. Pio Renteria was a big supporter of reform and density.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say. The other candidates in District 3 also seem to be generally pretty friendly to reform. And then the other big race is in District 5.
Yeah.
Ann Kitchen, who is sort of preservationist minded, is stepping down, and you've got Stephanie Bazan, who seems reform friendly. You've got Ryan Alter, who's very reform friendly. And so you have Ken Craig in District 5, who is an aide to Ann Kitchen. And he hasn't been, I haven't seen much from him about his views on housing. The assumption, I think, would be that his views would align closely with that of Ann Kitchen's. But we'll see.
So we'll see what happens in November.
Yeah.
Before we go, I want to talk about one more area that I think is important. There's a lot, but one more is transportation. And, so your thoughts on transportation, I-35, the airport, whatever you think.
I don't have any thoughts on the airport, really. Okay. I don't know what to say about that.
I have lots of them. So
great. And, on I-35, I'm very skeptical of any expansion. I don't really see a need for it. But I think it's just sort of extended, just another continuing the mistake of investing more into highways that just induces more demand. And by the way, I mean, TxDOT has been saying for 25 years now that the traffic levels on I-35 now are about the same as they were 25 years ago, despite TxDOT's frequent claims that it's going to double and triple,
Right.
And I'm just really focused on trying to undo what I see as the error of the car-centric planning that has prevailed since World War II. I'd very much like to... I think Austin should draw inspiration from Hyde Park and Clarksville and our old neighborhoods. Look at Hyde Park. It's a perfect street grid. Yeah. Why is that? Because it was set up for streetcars in the late 19th century. And I think that Project Connect is one piece of the puzzle. It's an important piece. It's an expensive piece. But it's absolutely necessary. And we really need to get the other pieces of the puzzle in place. And so the most important thing is, again, reforming zoning and land use regulations so that we actually get people living next to the rail lines so that people use them. But then beyond that, I think that electric bikes are just a huge opportunity. I have an e-bike. I ride it every day. It's amazing. I think it's a total game changer that could get a bigger percentage of the population biking than we ever thought was possible. But the main barrier to people biking, it's not the heat, it's not even the hills, especially with e-bikes, it's the infrastructure.
Right.
People don't feel safe biking here because we don't give bikers space, and we, make them share the road with lunatics and cars. And, so I think we're making slow progress in that regard, but I don't think we're being nearly as aggressive as we should. When you look at what other big cities around the world were doing, especially in the wake of COVID, they're, taking really aggressive action to prioritize pedestrians and bikers over cars. And we could just do so much, I think, to improve quality of life, to make transportation more affordable, and safer, by really, again, just sort of radically rethinking how we think about transportation and start thinking about people instead of cars.
Makes sense. Well, Jack, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. I think these, we have tremendous growth coming here, and with the stuff we talked about today, we can certainly build a greater Texas. And I appreciate it. Everybody out there, make sure you subscribe to the Austin Politics newsletter. Comes out 4 days a week. And
AustinPolitics.net.
There you go, AustinPolitics.net, and it's well worth it. So please subscribe. Thanks a lot, Jack. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Sean.